Mr. President, I have 9 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, the American people are being told, once again, not to trust their own eyes. Democrats are telling them not to worry about their soaring electricity bills. They're telling them to ignore rolling blackouts. Republicans are just fear-mongering, they say. But of course, the reality is that Americans have seen the power shortages. They've paid the higher bills. They've felt the weight of the past 4 years of the failed policies of the Biden administration. And we cannot ignore the resulting crisis anymore. The power grid is buckling. Energy demand is exploding. And the very people who created this mess are now telling us, quite audaciously, that there is no emergency. Why? Well, they claim that the United States is producing more energy than we have in American history. But what they conveniently omit is that we're consuming more energy than at any time in American history, and we're expected to need much, much more within just the next few years. Much more than we're producing, much more than we ever have produced. So it's not enough to just look at how much we're producing relative to what we have produced in the past when you don't take into account the demand, what we need, and what we need is going way, way up. Now, according to Goldman Sachs, artificial intelligence alone, just artificial intelligence, nothing else, not population growth, not any other uses, household or industrial, of energy. Just artificial intelligence alone is likely to drive a 160% increase in data center power demand by 2030. The largest data centers can consume more power than 700,000 households. That's equivalent to the energy use of a city of 1.8 million people. But there's no emergency, according to them. According to the sponsors of this resolution, this is just a handout. It's a handout to big oil, as they characterize it. Now, good luck with that. Try telling that to the American families and businesses that struggled during the January 2025 polar vortex when the U.S. power grid was pushed to its absolute limits. Electricity demand hit historic highs, forcing grid operators to rely heavily on coal and natural gas, the very sources of power that Democrats want to eliminate and have been working aggressively with some effectiveness to do precisely that, to eliminate, just to keep the lights on. It's not big oil that will suffer in the winters if we fail to keep the power on. Across multiple power market regions, electricity demand during that event set new single-day records as heating demand across sectors spiked. In response, grid operators had to rely heavily on dispatchable generation, primarily coal and natural gas, to ensure system reliability and stabilize supply during the extreme event. Now, during that time, coal-fired power plants dramatically increased their electric power output. That is, those coal-fired power plants that have not yet been torn down at the demand of Democratic-backed policies. In many regions, coal capacity factors soared above 80%, far exceeding typical winter levels. On the other hand, wind and solar were challenged by unfavorable weather conditions. On peak days, wind and solar generated only 3% and 0.2% of the incremental electricity needed to meet demand. But what exactly are Democrats worried about? What's their concern amidst that very emergency, which if that's not an emergency, I don't know what is. So what is it that they're worried about? Well, not grid failures, not surging energy costs, not the reliability of our power supply. No, they're concerned that President Trump is making things worse by canceling the wind and solar projects that failed to generate enough power to meet demand at those peak moments when it was so badly needed. They're using the same old playbook that they always have. Do anything to prevent President Trump from getting a win, regardless of whether his policies might actually bring relief to the American people, which, of course, they would. Mr. President, I've spent my career fighting against unchecked executive power. I authored the Article 1 Act to curb the abuse of presidential emergency declarations, requiring congressional approval within 30 days. But let me be clear, this is not an abuse of those powers. Not by a mile, not at all, not in any way, shape, or form. It is a real emergency. And if President Trump's declaration were put to a vote today, this chamber would affirm it. Congress has had countless chances to fix this problem and failed every time. Republicans have fought for years to reform our outdated permitting laws, only to be met with Democratic resistance at every turn. NEPA, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, Democrats treat these laws as if they were sacred texts, untouchable even when they're clearly broken. A sacred text that can't be not just repealed, but even amended meaningfully to avert the disaster that they've created, especially created in the hands of the previous administration. Now, at this moment, we hear that they're ready to play ball. Now and only now do they say, oh, yeah, we need to deal with this. Now, if that's true, great. But let's see. If Democrats are serious about fixing it, now is the time to prove it. Until Congress acts, how can anyone really blame the president for stepping in to address this emergency, which it is, which it has become, which it undeniably is? In some cases, an emergency can be created by the government itself, or at least severely exacerbated. And that is the case here. His executive order tells agencies to do exactly what Congress has neglected to do for years. Exactly what Congress has been unable to do, in large part because Democrats have resisted that, getting back to the sacred text theory of these same laws that have become part of the problem. However, rather than working with President Trump and Republicans in a productive way to try to make energy more accessible for Americans and more reliable, and of course, remain affordable, Senate Democrats are forcing a vote on a resolution to terminate President Trump's declaration and reinstate the restrictive energy policies from the Biden administration's Green New Deal. Look, Mr. President, at where those policies have left us, where they've put us, where we are, and where we're headed. Energy prices increased by 30.54%. Gasoline prices increased by 30.5%. Electricity prices increased by 28.55%, and natural gas prices increased by 33.3%. Meanwhile, Democrats' message to American families is clear. Pay more, expect less. It's this sort of gospel of scarcity. The idea that we have to live off of scarcity because that's what they demand, because government wants it that way for reasons that only they can fully articulate, but that the American people do not find persuasive. This is a problem. The United States is, in fact, in an energy emergency. Not because of a lack of resources, but because the Biden administration's unrelenting regulatory assault on domestic oil and gas production in blind adherence to the climate cartel has put us in this position. Now, President Biden's executive orders, including his orders that he issued on his very first day as President of the United States back in January of 2021, pausing all new oil and gas leasing on federal lands, where nearly 25% of U.S. oil production occurs, significantly hindered U.S. energy independence. Even after courts mandated the resumption of these leasing programs, essential to our energy development, Secretary Haaland slow-walked the process, offering the fewest acres for lease since World War II and holding a record low number of offshore lease sales. The chilling effect of the Biden administration's anti-production policies is as undeniable as it is indefensible as a matter of public policy. Oil companies are withdrawing from investments in federal lands due to the uncertainty created by erratic leasing decisions and hostile regulatory policies. Now, let's remember, of course, Mr. President, that this is made more severe by virtue of the fact that the United States government is not just the largest landowner in the United States, but it owns around 28%, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all land in the United States. We compound that by giving enormous discretion to federal land management agencies, to the executive branch. Then you put in place an administration that wants to preach and live by the gospel of scarcity, and that's a recipe for disaster. Biden's EPA contributed meaningfully to the problem as well. The Biden EPA introduced methane fees starting at $900 per metric ton in 2025, increasing to $1,500 over just a fairly short period of time. That imposes significant financial burdens on producers, particularly small operators. Now, lest anyone led by the Democratic talking points might be tempted to look at this and say, oh, but they're businesses. They can afford it. Suck it up. Just deal with it. That's not really who pays for this, Mr. President. No, these things get passed on. The wealthy folks, at least the wealthy folks who own these businesses, they're not the ones hardest hit by this. Those hardest hit are American families, particularly in sort of the low and middle income brackets. Those who, like so many Americans, live paycheck to paycheck. It's those people whose way of life, whose livelihood, whose ability to afford life is so dramatically affected by these regulatory intrusions into the marketplace. Those are the people who get hurt, and that really is a problem. Meanwhile, as our domestic production slows, our reliance on foreign oil increases. In 2023, we imported 1.3 million barrels per day from OPEC, up nearly 50% from 2020 levels. Meanwhile, critical mineral dependencies on foreign nations, particularly China, threaten everything from titanium in pacemakers and cobalt in batteries to copper in transmission lines and antimony in semiconductors. The absence of just one of these minerals would devastate the sectors they serve. And yet the Biden administration, with its vast discretion, as it invented and reinvented federal regulations, and as it presided over this Byzantine labyrinth of federal regulations, laws put in place by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, can make those things much worse. And it did make those things much worse. And the American people, hardworking Americans, are paying too high a price. Mr. President, the American people are done. They're done with Joe Biden's failed policies. Over 77 million Americans voted for President Trump just a few months ago. And a recent poll shows 60% of Americans support expanding American oil and gas production. Senate Republicans will not let Democrats delay and obstruct any longer. They've created and exacerbated an emergency. President Trump is addressing it as the law allows him to do. We will ensure the President has the tools necessary to deliver the results that the American people justifiably expect, demanded, and truly do deserve. Because the facts are undeniable. America is in an energy emergency because of the federal government, and specifically because of the previous administration's failed policies. Instead of embracing abundant, affordable, and reliable energy, Democrats, again preaching and living by the gospel of scarcity, in which they're so closely wedded, are doubling down on a radical agenda that's made everything from gasoline to electricity more expensive for working families. And remember, when the prices of those energy inputs goes up, so too does the price of everything else, because it becomes more expensive to make, to process, to buy, to sell, to transport, all of those same things. Instead of learning from those failures, Senate Democrats are trying to block President Trump from taking action to fix it. What, are they too afraid that their own policies will be exposed as the source of a significant amount of the problem? Well, you have to ask them about that, but one could certainly make that argument, and it certainly appears to many that this is the case. They're standing in the way of relief for American families, hoping that if they delay long enough, the American people will simply accept high costs as the new normal. Only in Washington could you light the house on fire and then act shocked when someone else tries to put it out. Make no mistake, Mr. President, that is exactly what's happening here. We refuse to let that happen. We applaud President Trump for taking action to address an emergency created by our own government, presided over, directed, embraced, and now defended by the Democratic Party. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.